When a rejected mail-order husband finds refuge with a silent widow on the Kansas prairie, their wordless bond becomes the most eloquent love story either has ever known. But when her cruel brother-in-law arrives with legal papers to tear them apart, will the voice she thought she'd lost forever be strong enough to save the life they've built together? Heinrich Zimmerman's hands shook as he read the telegram for the 5th time that morning. The train station in Cedar Junction, Kansas, buzzed with people carrying bags and saying goodbye, but Heinrich felt completely alone. The piece of paper in his thick fingers held words that cut deeper than any knife. Changed my mind about marriage. You are too heavy for farm work. Do not come to my property. M. Patterson. The summer heat of 1867 made his wool coat stick to his back, but Heinrich couldn't move from the wooden bench where he sat. Other passengers walked past him, their boots clicking on the platform boards. Some stared at his large body squeezed onto the small seat. A few children pointed and whispered to their mothers. Heinrich had heard it all before, the quiet comments about his size, the way people looked at him like he was some kind of circus animal. He had saved every penny for 3 months to buy his train ticket from St. Louis. His small room above the bakery where he worked felt like a prison. And when he saw the newspaper advertisement seeking a strong husband for widow with farm, hope had filled his chest for the first time in years. The letters between him and Martha Patterson had been kind and hopeful. She wrote about needing help with her crops and animals. He wrote about his skills fixing things and his dream of having a real family. But Martha Patterson had never asked what he looked like. Heinrich's stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He had spent his last coins on the train ticket, thinking he would eat his first meal as a married man at his new wife's table. Now he sat with empty pockets and an emptier heart, watching other people start their new lives while his seemed to be ending before it could begin. The train whistle blew one final time before the big black engine started moving away from the station. Smoke poured from its chimney, and Heinrich watched it disappear around a bend in the prairie. That train was his only way back to St. Louis, and now it was gone. He was stuck in this small Kansas town with no money, no place to sleep, and no one who wanted him. A group of men in cowboy hats walked by, talking loudly about cattle prices and weather. One of them looked at Heinrich and nudged his friend. "Look at the size of that fellow," he said, not caring that Heinrich could hear every word. "Bet he could eat a whole cow by himself." The men laughed as they walked away, their spurs jingling on the wooden boards. Heinrich felt his face turn red with shame. He had heard jokes about his weight his entire life. At school, the other children called him names. At work, his boss complained that he ate too much bread during his breaks. Even his own mother used to sigh when she looked at him, as if wondering how she had raised such a large son. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the train station began to empty. Soon, Heinrich was alone except for an old man sweeping the platform and a stray dog looking for food scraps. The dog approached Heinrich carefully, its tail wagging hopefully. Heinrich wished he had something to share with the hungry animal, but his own belly felt hollow and cramped. He pulled out the small cloth bag that held all his belongings, an extra shirt, a pair of socks with holes in them, his father's old pocket watch, and a small Bible his grandmother had given him before she died. Everything he owned in the world fit in a space smaller than a loaf of bread. Heinrich opened the Bible to a page he had read many times, where Jesus talked about God caring for the birds and flowers. "If God takes care of sparrows," Heinrich whispered to himself, "maybe he won't forget about me either." But sitting alone on that train platform, with his stomach empty and his heart broken, Heinrich found it hard to believe that anyone cared about him at all. He had always been too much for people too big, too hungry, too hopeful. Maybe Martha Patterson was right to send him away. Maybe he was fooling himself to think that anyone could love a man like him. The old man with the broom stopped sweeping and looked at Heinrich with kind eyes. "You waiting for someone, son?" he asked. Heinrich shook his head, not trusting his voice to work properly. "Train don't come back through here until Thursday," the old man said gently. "That's 3 days from now. You got somewhere to stay?" Again Heinrich shook his head. The old man leaned on his broom and studied Heinrich's face. "You look like a good fellow who's had some bad luck. There's a church about 2 blocks down Main Street. Pastor Williams sometimes lets folks sleep in the back room if they're in need. Tell him old Pete sent you." "Thank you," Heinrich managed to say, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. As Heinrich stood up from the bench, his knees popped loudly, and he felt dizzy from not eating. He picked up his small bag and started walking toward town, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, the empty train tracks stretched toward the horizon like 2 thin lines pointing toward all the dreams that would never come true. But as Heinrich walked down the dusty main street of Cedar Junction, he had no idea that someone was watching him from behind a store window, and that his story was just beginning. Inside Hoffman's General Store, Margaret pressed her nose against the glass window and watched the large stranger walk slowly down Main Street. His shoulders drooped like a man carrying the weight of the whole world, and something about his sadness made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since her husband and baby died 2 years ago. Margaret hadn't spoken a single word since the day she buried them both. The fever that took Johann and little Peter had also stolen her voice, leaving her throat feeling like it was filled with broken glass whenever she tried to make a sound. The doctor said nothing was wrong with her throat, but Margaret knew better. Some kinds of pain were too deep for words, and hers lived in a place where her voice used to be. She watched the stranger stop in front of the church and look up at its white wooden cross. Even from a distance, she could see him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. Margaret understood that kind of crying, the quiet kind that happened when you thought no one was looking. She had done plenty of it herself during the long, empty nights at her farm outside town. "That fellow's been sitting at the train station all morning," said Mr. Wilson, the store owner, as he counted coins behind the counter. "Heard he got left high and dry by Martha Patterson." She took one look at his size and sent him packing before he even got off the train. Margaret turned from the window and stared at Mr. Wilson with wide eyes. She had come to town to buy flour and sugar, but now those things seemed unimportant. The idea of someone being rejected because of how they looked made her stomach twist with anger. People in Cedar Junction had treated her differently too, ever since she stopped talking. They spoke to her like she was stupid or crazy, and some avoided her altogether. "Martha's got every right to choose her own husband," continued Mr. Wilson, not noticing Margaret's upset expression. "But it seems cruel to let a man travel all that way just to turn him away. Now he's stuck here with no money and nowhere to go." Margaret walked to the counter and pointed to the items she needed, then handed Mr. Wilson the coins from her small cloth purse. But her mind wasn't on shopping anymore. It was on the sad stranger who looked as lost and forgotten as she felt most days. As she walked outside with her packages, Margaret saw the stranger sitting on the church steps with his head in his hands. Pastor Williams stood nearby, talking in a gentle voice about God's plan and better days ahead. But Margaret could tell the stranger wasn't really listening. He looked like a man who had stopped believing in better days. Something inside Margaret's chest began to flutter like a bird trying to escape a cage. She hadn't felt this kind of feeling since before her family died. The urge to help someone, to reach out and offer comfort. For 2 years, she had lived like a ghost, going through the motions of daily life but never really connecting with other people. But looking at this stranger's pain, she remembered what it felt like to care about someone else's happiness. Margaret walked toward the church, her heart beating faster with each step. The stranger looked up when her shadow fell across him, and she saw that his eyes were brown and kind, even though they were red from crying. He was indeed a large man, with a round face and gentle expression that reminded her of her father, who had been a big man too, but the kindest person she had ever known. "Ma'am," the stranger said, quickly wiping his face and trying to stand up, but Pastor Williams put a hand on his shoulder to keep him seated. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a clean handkerchief that she had embroidered with tiny blue flowers during the long winter evenings. She offered it to the stranger, who looked at it like it was made of gold. "That's very kind of you, miss," Pastor Williams said. "This is Heinrich Zimmerman. He's had some troubles today and could use Christian kindness." Heinrich took the handkerchief carefully, as if he was afraid his big fingers might tear the delicate fabric. "Thank you," he said softly. I don't have anything to give you in return." Margaret shook her head and smiled, the first real smile that had crossed her face in months. She pointed to herself, then to Heinrich, then gestured toward the road that led out of town. The meaning was clear even without words. "Come with me." "I don't understand," Heinrich said, looking confused. "Are you inviting me somewhere?" Margaret nodded and took his hand. Her small fingers looked tiny next to his large, work-rough palm, but they fit together in a way that felt natural and right. She tugged gently, encouraging him to stand. Pastor Williams looked concerned. "Now, Margaret, you know you can't just take in strangers. What would people think? And Heinrich, you don't even know this lady." But Margaret was already walking toward her wagon, still holding Heinrich's hand. She had lived for 2 years caring too much about what people thought, and it had made her life small and gray. Today, for the first time since her world fell apart, she felt like doing something just because her heart told her it was right. Heinrich followed her, carrying his small bag and looking like he couldn't believe what was happening. As they reached her wagon, Margaret turned to face him. She pointed to her throat and shook her head sadly, then made a gesture like she was cutting something. Heinrich's eyes widened as he understood. "You can't speak?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, then placed her hand over her heart and nodded again. The message was clear. "I cannot speak with my voice, but my heart can still communicate." Heinrich looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw something change in his expression. The sadness was still there, but now it was mixed with wonder and gratitude. "You're the first person today who's looked at me like I might be worth something," he said quietly. Margaret climbed onto the wagon seat and patted the spot beside her. Heinrich hesitated for a moment, then climbed up next to her. As she picked up the reins and clicked to her horses, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the warm feeling of not being alone. As they drove out of Cedar Junction toward her farm, neither Heinrich nor Margaret spoke, but both felt like they were finally heading toward something that might, just maybe, feel like home. The sound of hammering echoed across the prairie as Heinrich fixed the broken fence post that had been bothering Margaret for weeks. Sweat dripped from his forehead in the morning heat, but he felt more alive than he had in years. 3 days had passed since Margaret brought him to her small farm, and each sunrise brought new purpose to his life. Margaret's homestead sat like a tiny island in an ocean of golden grass. The house was built from gray stones that kept it cool even in summer, with a red roof that could be seen for miles. Behind the house stood a barn that leaned slightly to the left, chicken coops where fat hens clucked contentedly, and a vegetable garden that grew in neat, straight rows despite the harsh Kansas sun. Everything about the farm told Heinrich that Margaret was a hard worker who took pride in her home. The chickens were well-fed and healthy. The vegetables grew strong and green. Even the milk cow, a gentle brown creature named Bessie, seemed happy in her small pasture. But Heinrich also noticed things that showed how hard it was for one person to manage everything alone. The fence that needed mending, the barn door that hung crooked, the well pump that squeaked and complained every time it was used. Heinrich discovered that he and Margaret could talk to each other without words better than most people talked with them. When the pump handle broke completely on his second day, Margaret watched him work with tools like she was reading a fascinating book. She handed him exactly the right wrench before he could ask for it. She held the pipe steady while he tightened the bolts. When he finished the repair and cold, clear water gushed from the pump, Margaret clapped her hands and smiled so brightly that Heinrich felt his chest swell with pride. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun paint the sky orange and pink, Margaret brought out a slate board and piece of chalk. She wrote carefully, "Thank you for fixing the pump. I've been carrying water from the creek for 2 months." Heinrich took the chalk and wrote back, "Thank you for giving me a place to stay. I promise I'll earn my keep." Margaret erased his words and wrote, "You already have." The simple exchange made Heinrich feel valued in a way he never had before. All his life, people had seen his size as a problem: too big, too heavy, too much. But Margaret looked at his large hands and saw someone who could fix things. She watched his broad shoulders and saw someone who could carry heavy loads. When Heinrich split wood for the stove, Margaret didn't complain about how much food he ate for breakfast. Instead, she cooked extra bacon and eggs because she understood that big men needed big meals to do big work. On his 4th morning at the farm, Heinrich woke before dawn to find Margaret already in the kitchen, packing food into a wooden basket. She wore her old brown dress and a sun hat that had seen better days. When she saw Heinrich, she pointed to the basket, then to herself, then toward town. "You're going to Cedar Junction?" Heinrich asked. Margaret nodded and handed him the slate. She had written, "Market day, sell eggs and vegetables. Back by afternoon." Heinrich felt a cold worry settle in his stomach. He had been hiding at the farm since his arrival, grateful to avoid the stares and whispers of town folks. But he also felt bad about letting Margaret go alone when he could help carry heavy baskets and load the wagon. "Can I come with you?" he wrote on the slate. Margaret looked surprised, then concerned. She erased his question and wrote, "People will stare, ask questions. Are you ready for that?" Heinrich thought about Martha Patterson's cruel telegram. He remembered the men at the train station making jokes about his size. Part of him wanted to stay hidden at the farm forever, where Margaret's kind eyes were the only ones that saw him. But another part of him, a part that was growing stronger each day, knew that he couldn't hide forever. If he was going to build a life here, he needed to face the world again. "I'm ready," he wrote. The ride to town took an hour, and Heinrich spent most of it watching Margaret handle the horses. She drove with confidence and skill, guiding the animals around holes in the dirt road and keeping them calm when a rabbit darted across their path. Heinrich found himself admiring not just her driving, but everything about her. The way she sat straight and proud on the wagon seat, the way she smiled when a meadowlark sang from a fence post, the way she seemed to notice every flower and cloud and change in the wind. When they reached Cedar Junction's market square, Heinrich saw other farmers setting up tables and displaying their goods. Women in clean dresses examined vegetables and haggled over prices. Children ran between the stalls, chasing each other and laughing. It looked like a normal, happy scene, but Heinrich felt his old nervousness creeping back as people began to notice him. Margaret seemed to sense his discomfort. She touched his arm gently and wrote on her slate, "Just help me unload. Don't worry about them." But as Heinrich lifted heavy baskets from the wagon, he could hear the whispers starting. "That's the man Martha Patterson rejected. Look how big he is. What's he doing with the mute woman?" Heinrich's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept working, focusing on Margaret's encouraging nods instead of the curious stares. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, approached their table. "These are the most beautiful tomatoes I've seen all summer," she said to Margaret. "And you must be Heinrich. I heard you've been helping Margaret with her farm work." Heinrich looked up, surprised. He had expected criticism, not compliments. "My late husband was a big man too," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Strongest, gentlest soul you ever met. Size of a man's body doesn't tell you anything about the size of his heart." She bought 24 eggs and a basket of vegetables, then patted Heinrich's arm kindly. "You take good care of our Margaret. That girl's been alone too long." As Mrs. Henderson walked away, Heinrich felt something shift inside him. Maybe not everyone in Cedar Junction would judge him by his appearance. Maybe some people could see past his size to the person underneath. But just as Heinrich began to relax, he noticed a group of men gathering near the blacksmith shop, pointing in their direction and talking in voices too low to hear. One of them was the cowboy who had made jokes about Heinrich at the train station. Another was a thin man in a black suit who kept checking a pocket watch and looking impatient. Margaret noticed them too. She quickly wrote on her slate, "We should go soon. Something feels wrong." Heinrich looked at the men again and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. The man in the black suit was walking toward their table now, and his expression was not friendly. Heinrich had a sudden, terrible feeling that their peaceful days at the farm were about to come to an end. "Excuse me, miss." The man in the black suit stood directly in front of Margaret's market table, blocking her view of the other customers. His voice was sharp and cold, like winter wind cutting through thin cloth. "Are you the woman they call the mute widow?" Heinrich felt every muscle in his body tense as he watched Margaret's face go pale. She nodded slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "My name is Samuel Cross. I represent certain business interests in Denver." The man pulled out an official-looking piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I've been hired to locate you regarding some outstanding debts left by your late husband." Margaret shook her head vigorously and reached for her slate, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the chalk. Heinrich moved closer to her, his protective instincts flaring like a fire that had been poked with a stick. "What kind of debts?" Heinrich asked, his voice deeper and more threatening than he meant it to be. Samuel Cross looked Heinrich up and down with obvious disgust. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. This is a family matter." "I'm not family," Heinrich said, "but I am her friend, and friends don't let people get bullied by men in fancy suits." Cross laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Friend? Is that what they're calling it these days? A respectable widow living alone with a man who's not her husband." He looked around the market square, making sure other people could hear his words. "Sounds scandalous to me." Several townspeople had stopped their shopping to listen to the conversation. Heinrich could feel their eyes on him and Margaret, and he saw some of them whispering behind their hands. The comfortable feeling he had started to develop in Cedar Junction began to crumble like a cookie dropped on the floor. Margaret finally managed to write on her slate with trembling hands, "My husband died 2 years ago. All debts were paid." Cross read her words and smiled in a way that made Heinrich's skin crawl. "According to my client, Johann Hoffman borrowed money shortly before his death to expand his farming operation. The loan was never repaid, and with interest, the amount now totals nearly $500. Heinrich whistled softly. $500 was more money than most people saw in 5 years. There was no way Margaret's small farm could earn that much, even in a good year. "Who is your client?" Heinrich demanded. "William Hoffman, brother of the deceased. As the nearest male relative, he has legal right to collect on family debts." Cross folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "Mr. Hoffman will be arriving next week to settle this matter personally." Margaret wrote frantically on her slate. "Johann had no brothers. He was an only child." Cross shrugged. "That's not what my paperwork says. And since you can't speak for yourself in court, it will be your word against official documents." The cruel logic of Cross's words hit Heinrich like a punch to the stomach. In 1867, a woman's testimony was often ignored in legal matters, especially if she couldn't speak aloud, and Margaret's silence would be used as a weapon against her in any courtroom. "This is ridiculous," Heinrich said loudly. "You can't just show up and claim someone owes money without proof." "I have all the proof I need," Cross replied smoothly. "But I'll tell you what, if the lady can pay half the debt now, we might be willing to work out a payment plan for the rest." Heinrich saw the trap immediately. Even if Margaret had that much money, which she certainly didn't, paying anything would be admitting that the debt was real. But refusing to pay would make her look guilty when William Hoffman arrived. Around them, the market day continued, but Heinrich noticed that people were giving their table a wide space now. Nobody wanted to get involved in what looked like serious legal trouble. Mrs. Henderson caught Heinrich's eye from across the square and gave him a sympathetic look, but even she didn't approach. Margaret tugged on Heinrich's sleeve and showed him her slate. "We need to leave. Now." Heinrich nodded and began packing up their remaining vegetables and eggs. His hands moved quickly, but his mind was moving even faster. Someone was trying to steal Margaret's farm, and they were using her inability to speak as part of their plan. The question was, who was William Hoffman, and why was he targeting a widow who had nothing to take? As they loaded the wagon, Cross called out one final threat. "You have until next Friday to come up with the money, lady. After that, Mr. Hoffman will be forced to take other measures to recover his property." The ride back to the farm was quiet except for the creaking of wagon wheels and the soft snorting of the horses. Heinrich wanted to say something comforting to Margaret, but what comfort could he offer? He was a man with no money, no legal standing, and no real knowledge of the law. How could he protect someone when he couldn't even protect himself from cruel words at a train station? When they reached the farmhouse, Margaret climbed down from the wagon and walked straight to her vegetable garden. She knelt among the tomato plants and began pulling weeds with angry, jerky movements. Heinrich understood that she needed to work with her hands when her heart was upset, so he unhitched the horses and gave them water and oats. Later, as the sun began to set, Heinrich found Margaret sitting on the front porch steps. She had been crying. He could tell from her red eyes and the way she held herself. When she saw him, she handed him her slate. "I'm scared," she had written. "Not just of losing the farm, but of losing you too. Who would want to stay with a woman who brings nothing but trouble?" Heinrich sat down beside her on the steps. The boards creaked under his weight, but they held firm, just like he hoped their friendship would. He took the chalk and wrote, "I came here with nothing and no one wanted me. You gave me a home and made me feel valuable. Now it's my turn to help you." Margaret looked at his words for a long time, then wrote, "How can we fight someone who has money and legal papers?" Heinrich stared out at the prairie, watching the grass wave in the evening breeze. He had spent his whole life being pushed around by people who thought they were better than him. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for someone he cared about. "I don't know yet," he wrote on the slate, "but I promise you this. I won't let anyone take your home away. We'll find a way to stop them." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Heinrich made a silent vow. He might not have money or legal papers or a fancy education, but he had something that Samuel Cross and William Hoffman didn't have. A heart full of love for the brave woman sitting beside him. And sometimes Heinrich thought love was the strongest weapon of all. But first, they needed to find out who William Hoffman really was, and why he was so determined to destroy Margaret's peaceful life. Thunder crashed overhead as Heinrich dug frantically through the wooden trunk in Margaret's bedroom, searching for any papers that might prove Johann Hoffman had no brothers. Rain pounded against the windows like angry fists, and lightning lit up the small room in quick, scary flashes. It was their 5th day since the market confrontation, and William Hoffman would arrive tomorrow. "Find anything yet?" Heinrich called out, his voice tight with worry. Margaret shook her head from where she knelt beside another box near the bed. Her hands moved through old letters and documents, but so far they had found nothing helpful. Wedding papers, receipts for farm supplies, a few photographs of Johann smiling beside his crops, but no family records, no mention of siblings, no proof that could save her farm. The storm outside seemed to match the storm in Heinrich's heart. Every time lightning flashed, he could see Margaret's pale face in the brief light, and his chest ached with the desire to protect her. But how could a man with no education fight someone who had lawyers and official papers? Heinrich knew how to fix broken pumps and mend fences, but he didn't know anything about courts and legal battles. A particularly loud thunderclap made Margaret jump and drop the box she was holding. Papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, and she began gathering them quickly. Heinrich crawled over to help, and that's when he saw it. A letter addressed to Johann, but with a return address that made Heinrich's breath catch in his throat. "Margaret," he said urgently, holding up the envelope. "Look at this return address. It's from a William Hoffman in Denver." Margaret took the letter with shaking hands. The envelope had been opened long ago, and the paper inside was yellowed with age. As she unfolded it, her eyes grew wide with recognition and fear. The letter was dated 3 years earlier, just months before Johann's death. Heinrich read it aloud, his voice growing angrier with each word. "Johann, I know you got my previous letters. You can't hide from family forever. What happened between us was years ago. I need money for my business, and blood should help blood. Your farm is doing well. A loan would be nothing to you but everything to me. Write back soon. Your cousin, William." Heinrich looked at Margaret, whose face had gone white as the lightning outside. She grabbed her slate and wrote quickly. "Johann showed me this letter. Said William was a distant cousin who always wanted money. Johann refused to lend him anything because William spent money on gambling and drinking. So this William person is real," Heinrich said. "But he's not Johann's brother. He's a cousin who was angry about being refused money." Margaret nodded and wrote more. "Johann said William threatened him, said he would find a way to get what he deserved from our family." Heinrich felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the storm. This wasn't just about money. This was about revenge. William Hoffman was using false papers to steal Margaret's farm as punishment for Johann's refusal to help him years ago. "We have proof now," Heinrich said, waving the letter. "This shows William lied about being Johann's brother. We can take this to the sheriff." But even as he spoke the words, Heinrich knew it wouldn't be that simple. The letter proved William was a cousin, not a brother, but it didn't prove the debt papers were fake. And in a court battle between a man with official documents and a woman who couldn't speak for herself, Heinrich feared which side the law would choose. Another flash of lightning revealed something else scattered among the papers on the floor. A small, leather-bound book that looked like a diary. Margaret picked it up and opened it carefully. Heinrich could see that it was filled with Johann's handwriting. "It's Johann's journal," Margaret wrote on her slate. "He wrote in it every day." Heinrich took the journal and flipped through the pages, looking for any mention of William or loans or debts. Most entries were about weather and crops and daily farm work, but near the end, Heinrich found what they were looking for. "Listen to this," Heinrich said, reading from an entry dated just 2 months before Johann's death. "William wrote again today demanding money, told Margaret not to worry about it. Some family brings nothing but trouble. I will never give that man a penny. He lost the right to call himself family when he tried to court Margaret behind my back before our wedding. Some men have no honor." Heinrich and Margaret stared at each other as the full truth sank in. William Hoffman hadn't just wanted money from Johann. He had wanted Margaret herself. When Johann refused both requests, William had waited for his chance at revenge. Johann's death had given him the perfect opportunity to take both the farm and the woman he felt he deserved. "This is worse than we thought," Heinrich wrote on the slate. "He's not just trying to steal your farm. He's trying to steal your whole life." Margaret took the chalk with trembling hands and wrote, "What if he succeeds? What if the sheriff believes his papers instead of old letters and diary entries?" Heinrich looked out the window at the storm raging across the prairie. Tomorrow, William Hoffman would arrive in Cedar Junction with his false documents and his legal threats. The man probably had lawyers and witnesses ready to support his lies. All Heinrich and Margaret had were old letters and the testimony of a woman who couldn't speak in court. But as Heinrich watched Margaret carefully gathering up Johann's papers and holding them close to her chest, he felt something new growing inside him. Not just love for this brave woman, but a fierce determination to fight for what was right. He had spent his whole life accepting rejection and defeat, but this time was different. This time he had someone worth fighting for. "We need help," Heinrich wrote on the slate. "Someone who knows the law better than we do." Margaret nodded and wrote back, "Pastor Williams went to college before he became a preacher. Maybe he can help us understand what to do." Heinrich stood up and walked to the window, watching the lightning dance across the dark sky. Tomorrow would bring the biggest challenge of his life, but tonight, in this small room with papers scattered around them like puzzle pieces, he and Margaret had found something important, the truth about William Hoffman's real motives. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Heinrich said aloud, "at least we know who we're really fighting, and we have each other." Through the storm and the darkness, Heinrich felt a small spark of hope beginning to grow in his chest. They might not have lawyers or official papers, but they had something William Hoffman would never understand, the power of two people who truly cared about each other, working together against a common enemy. The real battle was about to begin. Pastor Williams spread the letters and journal entries across his kitchen table like pieces of evidence in a court case. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he studied each document carefully. The morning sun streamed through his windows, but the atmosphere in the small parsonage felt heavy with worry and determination. "This is quite damning," Pastor Williams said, tapping Johann's journal with his finger. "These entries clearly show that William made romantic advances toward Margaret and was refused money multiple times. But I have to ask you both, are you prepared for how ugly this fight might become?" Heinrich looked at Margaret, who sat stiffly in her chair with her hands folded in her lap. She had barely slept the night before, and dark circles under her eyes showed how much stress she was carrying. But when she met Heinrich's gaze, He saw steel in her expression that reminded him why he admired her so much. "We don't have a choice," Heinrich answered for both of them. "William Hoffman is planning to steal everything she has. We can't just stand by and let that happen." Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "Here's what we're facing from a legal standpoint. In Kansas territory, a woman's property rights are limited, especially if she's a widow. If William can prove his debt claim in front of a judge, he could force the sale of the farm to pay what's supposedly owed." Margaret grabbed her slate and wrote quickly, "What if we can prove he's lying?" "That's our best hope," Pastor Williams replied. "But we need to be smart about how we present our evidence. Johann's journal helps, but William will probably claim it was written after his death to support your case. The letter from William himself is better. It shows he was angry about being refused money." Heinrich leaned forward in his chair. "What about the fact that he lied about being Johann's brother instead of just a cousin? That's important too, but legally speaking, a cousin could still inherit debts if he was the closest male relative. The real issue is whether the debt itself is legitimate." Pastor Williams removed his glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. "We need to find out if William actually has any real legal documents, or if he's hoping to intimidate Margaret into paying money she doesn't owe." A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Pastor Williams went to answer it, and Heinrich heard him talking to someone in a low, urgent voice. When the pastor returned, his expression was grim. "That was Mrs. Henderson from the market. She wanted to warn us that William Hoffman arrived in town this morning, earlier than expected. He's at the hotel right now, and he brought 2 other men with him." Heinrich felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. What kind of men? "The kind who look like they settle disagreements with their fists instead of their words," Pastor Williams said bluntly. "Mrs. Henderson said one of them was asking questions around town about Heinrich, where he came from, why he's staying at Margaret's farm, whether anyone knows anything about his background." Margaret's face went pale, and she wrote frantically on her slate, "They're trying to find ways to hurt Heinrich too. This is my problem, not his." Heinrich read her words and felt a surge of protective anger. "It became my problem the day you showed me kindness when no one else would. We're in this together now." Pastor Williams stood up and began pacing around the small kitchen. "Here's what I think we should do. We need to get ahead of William's accusations before he has a chance to spread lies around town. I suggest we call a public meeting this afternoon, let everyone hear both sides of the story at the same time." "Will that work?" Heinrich asked doubtfully. "It's better than letting William control the conversation. In a small town like Cedar Junction, public opinion matters almost as much as legal documents. If we can convince people that William is trying to cheat a helpless widow, they might pressure him to drop his claims." Margaret wrote on her slate, "But I can't speak for myself in a public meeting. How can people believe my side if they can't hear my voice?" Pastor Williams smiled for the first time that morning. "That's where Heinrich comes in. You don't need to speak, Margaret. You need someone who believes in you to speak for you. And Heinrich here has been getting quite good at understanding what you want to say." Heinrich felt his mouth go dry. The idea of speaking in front of a crowd terrified him almost as much as facing William Hoffman's threats. All his life, people had made fun of him when he tried to talk in public. They laughed at his nervousness, his sweating, the way his voice sometimes cracked when he got emotional. "I don't know if I can do that," Heinrich admitted. "I'm not good with public speaking. What if I mess up and make things worse for Margaret?" Margaret reached over and took his hand, then wrote on her slate, "You are the bravest man I know. You left everything behind to start a new life. You stayed with me when most people would have run away from my problems. If anyone can tell my story, it's you." Pastor Williams nodded in agreement. "The whole town has seen how hard you work at Margaret's farm, Heinrich. They've seen how you treat her with respect and kindness. Your character speaks louder than any fancy lawyer's words." Heinrich looked down at Margaret's small hand holding his large, rough one. 3 weeks ago, he had been a rejected, friendless man sitting alone on a train platform. Now, this brave woman was trusting him to fight for her home and her future. The responsibility felt heavier than any load he had ever carried, but it also felt like the most important thing he would ever do. All right, Heinrich said finally. I'll speak for you at the meeting. But you have to promise me something, Margaret. She looked at him questioningly. Promise me that no matter what William Hoffman says about me, about my weight, my background, my right to be here, you won't believe his lies. I may not be much to look at, but everything I feel for you is real and honest. Margaret smiled through tears that had started flowing down her cheeks. She erased her slate and wrote in careful, clear letters. You are everything to look at. You are good and kind and strong. I am proud to have you speak for me. Pastor Williams cleared his throat and looked out the window toward town. We'd better start preparing for this meeting, because if I know anything about men like William Hoffman, he's not going to give up without a fight. And this afternoon, the whole town is going to find out what kind of people we really are. Heinrich squeezed Margaret's hand and felt her squeeze back. Whatever happened at the meeting, they would face it together. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Heinrich felt like they might actually have a chance to win. William Hoffman slammed his fist on the hotel room table so hard that the water pitcher jumped and nearly fell to the floor. His two hired men, Jake and Murphy, sat across from him looking uncomfortable as their boss's face turned red with anger. 3 weeks, William shouted, pacing back and forth in the small room. I've been planning this for 3 weeks. And now some fat stranger thinks he can ruin everything by playing hero. Jake, a thin man with a scar across his left cheek, shifted nervously in his chair. Boss, maybe we should just stick to the original plan. Show the debt papers, take the farm, and get out of this dusty town. It's not that simple anymore, William snapped, stopping his pacing to glare out the window toward the church where Pastor Williams was hanging notices about the afternoon meeting. That German pig has been asking questions, looking through papers, getting people to think about things they shouldn't be thinking about. Murphy, who was built like a tree trunk with arms like branches, cracked his knuckles loudly. Want me to have a talk with him? Sometimes big men fall down real easy when they're not expecting it. William considered this for a moment, his dark eyes calculating. No, not yet. If Heinrich Zimmermann gets hurt right before the meeting, people will blame us. We need to be smarter than that. He walked to his leather bag and pulled out a folder filled with official-looking documents. These papers cost me $200 to have made in Denver. They look real enough to fool a small-town preacher and a bunch of farmers. But if people start examining them too closely, asking too many questions, what's really in them papers? Jake asked curiously. William's mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Enough truth mixed with lies to make them believable. Johann did owe money when he died, $50 to the grain merchant in Topeka. I bought that debt for $20 and had the documents changed to say $500 instead of $50. And instead of listing me as a distant cousin, I'm now his loving brother who generously loaned him money to expand his farm. Murphy whistled low. That's some fancy lying, boss. It's not lying if nobody can prove it's false, William corrected. And who's going to contradict me? Johann's dead, Margaret can't speak, and everyone else in this town barely knew them. Through the window, William could see people gathering in the street, talking in small groups and pointing toward the church. Word about the meeting was spreading fast, and from the expressions on people's faces, he could tell that Heinrich and Pastor Williams had been busy sharing their version of events. Boss, Jake said hesitantly, what if this don't work? What if people believe the German instead of us? William's expression turned cold and dangerous. Then we moved to plan 2. Murphy, you still have that bottle of whiskey I told you to bring? Murphy nodded and pulled a brown bottle from his bag. Good. If the meeting doesn't go our way, we're going to pay a visit to Margaret's farm tonight. A few drinks to make it look like Heinrich was drunk. Maybe a fight that got out of hand. Maybe an accident with a lamp near some hay. William let the implication hang in the air. Jake's eyes widened. You want to burn down the farm? I want to remove obstacles, William said coldly. If Margaret has no farm and no protector, she'll be grateful for any family member willing to take care of her. And I've been wanting to take care of Margaret for a very long time. The 3 men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of William's plan settling over them like a dark cloud. Outside, the church bell began to ring, calling people to the meeting that would decide everything. William straightened his black suit jacket and checked his appearance in the small mirror above the wash basin. He had practiced his story so many times that he almost believed it himself, the grieving brother-in-law, trying to help a poor widow understand her late husband's financial obligations, being opposed by a stranger with suspicious motives. "Remember," he told his men as they prepared to leave for the meeting, "I'm the victim here. Johann borrowed money from his loving brother and died before he could pay it back. Now his widow is being influenced by a man who probably plans to steal the farm for himself. We're the good guys trying to protect a helpless woman from being taken advantage of." Jake nodded, but he still looked worried. "What if someone asks why you waited 2 years to collect this debt?" William had an answer ready for that too. "I was giving Margaret time to grieve and get back on her feet. But when I heard she was living unmarried with a strange man, I knew I had to step in before she lost everything to a con artist." As they walked toward the church, William felt confident about his chances. He had money, official papers, and a story that painted him as the responsible family member. Heinrich had nothing but the word of a woman who couldn't speak and the support of a small-town preacher. In William's experience, money and legal documents always won against sentiment and good intentions. But as they approached the church and William saw the crowd gathering outside, men and women, young and old, all talking seriously about the situation, he felt the first small flutter of doubt in his chest. These people knew Margaret and Heinrich. They had seen how hard Heinrich worked, how respectfully he treated Margaret, how much her life had improved since he arrived. William pushed down his doubts and reminded himself that he had come too far to turn back now. He had spent 2 years planning this revenge against Johann's family. He had paid good money for fake documents and hired men to help him. One way or another, he was going to get what he felt he deserved. As Pastor Williams stepped out of the church to welcome people inside, William fixed his most sincere expression on his face and prepared to give the performance of his life. Because if his lies didn't work in this meeting, he was prepared to use much more dangerous methods to get what he wanted. The battle for Margaret's future was about to begin. The church filled with people like water rushing into a bucket. Every pew packed tight with farmers, storekeepers, wives, and children who had never seen such excitement in their quiet town. Heinrich sat in the front row beside Margaret, his hands sweating so much that he had to wipe them on his pants every few minutes. Behind them, he could hear whispered conversations and the rustle of people settling into their seats. "Look at the size of that crowd," Heinrich murmured to Margaret, his voice shaky with nerves. "Half the county must be here." Margaret squeezed his arm reassuringly and showed him her slate. "They came because they care about what's right. That's good for us." Pastor Williams stood at the front of the church, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of stress as he watched more people pour through the doors. This was the biggest gathering the little church had ever hosted, and the weight of what was about to happen hung heavy in the air like humidity before a storm. William Hoffman entered with his 2 men, and Heinrich felt his stomach clench as he got his first good look at his opponent. William was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from money and education. He moved through the crowd like he owned the place, shaking hands and introducing himself as Johann's grieving brother. "Good afternoon, folks," Pastor Williams called out, raising his voice to quiet the crowd. "We're here today because serious accusations have been made, and both sides deserve to be heard fairly. I want everyone to listen respectfully and remember that we're seeking truth, not taking sides based on gossip." William stood up from his seat near the back. "If I may, Reverend, I'd like to speak first. As the injured party in this situation, I believe I have that right." Pastor Williams nodded reluctantly. "Mr. Hoffman, you may present your case." William walked to the front of the church with the smooth confidence of a man used to commanding attention. He pulled out his folder of documents and placed it on the pulpit like it was a holy book. "Friends," William began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "I come before you today with a heavy heart. 2 years ago, I lost my beloved brother Johann to the fever. But instead of being allowed to grieve in peace, I've discovered that the debt he owed me, money I loaned him in good faith to help his farming operation, has never been repaid." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heinrich could see people's faces, some nodding sympathetically at William's words. Now, I understand that Johann's widow has been through difficult times, William continued, his voice dripping with false concern. That's why I've been patient, why I've waited 2 years before approaching her about this matter. But when I learned that she's been living unmarried with a stranger, a man who appeared in our community under suspicious circumstances, I knew I could no longer ignore my duty to protect my family's interests. Heinrich felt heat rising in his cheeks as all eyes turned toward him. William's words made him sound like a criminal or a con artist, and he could see doubt creeping into some people's expressions. These documents, William said, holding up his papers, show clearly that Johann Hoffmann borrowed $500 from his brother. That's me shortly before his death. The loan was to be repaid within 2 years, with interest. That time has now passed, and the debt stands at nearly $600. Mrs. Henderson, sitting 3 rows behind Heinrich, called out, $600? That's more money than most of us see in 5 years. What did Johann need that much money for? William had his answer ready. Farm expansion, ma'am. Johann had big dreams about increasing his crop yields and buying more livestock. Unfortunately, those dreams died with him, but the debt remains. Pastor Williams stepped forward. Mr. Hoffman, may I examine those documents? Of course, Reverend. I have nothing to hide. As Pastor Williams studied the papers, Heinrich watched William's face carefully. The man looked confident, but Heinrich noticed a small muscle twitching near his left eye, the kind of nervous tick that people got when they were lying about something important. These appear to be in order, Pastor Williams said reluctantly, but I do have some questions about the timing and the amounts involved. William's expression hardened slightly. Are you questioning the legitimacy of legal documents, Reverend? I'm asking for clarification, Pastor Williams replied firmly, because we have evidence that contradicts some of your claims. The crowd stirred with interest. This was better than any traveling show that had ever come through Cedar Junction. What evidence? William demanded. Pastor Williams motioned for Heinrich to stand up. Heinrich's legs felt wobbly as he rose, and he could feel dozens of eyes examining every inch of his large frame. This was the moment he had been dreading, standing in front of all these people, trying to speak for Margaret when he could barely speak for himself. Go ahead, Heinrich, Pastor Williams encouraged. Tell everyone what you and Margaret discovered. Heinrich's mouth felt dry as cotton, but he thought about Margaret sitting behind him, trusting him to defend her home and her future. That gave him the courage to open his mouth and begin. Mr. Hoffman says he's Johann's brother, Heinrich said, his voice starting quiet but growing stronger with each word. But we found a letter in Johann's papers, a letter written by this same William Hoffman 3 years ago. In that letter, William calls himself Johann's cousin, not his brother. And he was asking for money then too, money that Johann refused to give him. The crowd murmured louder now, and Heinrich saw William's confident expression crack slightly. Furthermore, Heinrich continued, feeling more confident as he went on, we found entries in Johann's personal journal that tell a very different story about Mr. William Hoffman. According to Johann's own words, William had tried to court Margaret before she married Johann, and when she refused him, he became angry and threatening. William's face turned red. Those are lies, fabrications. Anyone could write fake journal entries after someone dies. Then explain this, Heinrich said, holding up William's own letter. This is your handwriting, isn't it, Mr. Hoffman? And it's postmarked 3 years ago, long before Johann died. In it, you clearly state that you're his cousin, and you're asking for money that Johann doesn't want to lend you. Heinrich began reading from the letter, his voice carrying William's own words back to him like an echo from the past. With each sentence, William's confident facade crumbled a little more, and the crowd's sympathy began shifting toward Margaret and Heinrich. But William wasn't finished fighting yet. Heinrich could see something dangerous building in the man's eyes, the look of someone who was cornered and ready to strike back with everything he had. The real confrontation was just beginning. William Hoffman's face twisted with rage as he snatched the letter from Heinrich's hands, his careful mask of respectability falling away like paint peeling off a rotten board. The packed church fell silent as people watched this well-dressed stranger transform before their eyes into something ugly and dangerous. "You think you're so clever, don't you, you fat fool?" William snarled. His voice no longer smooth and persuasive but harsh and threatening. "Coming into my family's business, turning people against me with your lies and fake sympathy." Heinrich stepped back, startled by the sudden change in William's behavior. Around them, the crowd began murmuring uneasily as they witnessed William's true nature emerging. Pastor Williams moved closer to the front. "Mr. Hoffman, please control yourself. This is a house of worship." "Control myself?" William laughed bitterly. "I've been controlling myself for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to claim what should have been mine from the beginning." He turned to face the crowd, his eyes wild with fury. "You want to know the truth? Fine. I'll give you the truth." Margaret gripped Heinrich's arm tightly, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Her face had gone pale as she watched William's breakdown. "Johann Hoffman stole everything from me," William shouted, pointing an accusing finger toward Margaret. "I met her first, courted her first, loved her first. But Johann swooped in with his bigger farm and his promises, and she chose him over me. Then, when I needed help, when my business in Denver was failing and I asked my own family for a loan, Johann refused me. He let me lose everything while he lived comfortably with the woman who should have been my wife." The church erupted in shocked whispers. This wasn't about debt at all. This was about jealousy and revenge that had been festering for years. Heinrich felt a surge of protective anger rising in his chest. "So you're admitting that you lied about the debt? That you're trying to steal Margaret's farm because you're angry she didn't choose you?" William's men, Jake and Murphy, had stood up and were moving closer to the front of the church. Heinrich could see their hands resting on their gun belts, and he realized that William had come prepared for violence if his legal scheme failed. "I'm taking what I deserve," William declared. "If Johann hadn't died of fever, I would have found another way to make him pay. But this works even better. Once Margaret loses her farm to pay my debt, she'll have nowhere to go except with me. And this time, she won't have any choice in the matter." The cruel logic of William's plan hit everyone in the church at the same time. This wasn't just about money. This was about a man who planned to force a woman into marriage by destroying her life and leaving her with no other options. Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the grain store, stood up from his pew. "Now see here, Hoffman. You can't force a woman to marry you by stealing her property." "Can't I?" William sneered. "Show me the law that says otherwise. A woman alone, with no family and no means of support? She'll be grateful for any man willing to take care of her, especially after I spread word about how she's been living in sin with this stranger." Heinrich felt his hands clenching into fists. All his life, he had avoided fights because his size made him an easy target for accusations of bullying. But watching William threaten Margaret, seeing the fear in her eyes, Heinrich felt a new kind of strength building inside him. "You're not taking anything," Heinrich said, his voice deeper and more commanding than it had ever been before. "Margaret is under my protection now." William laughed mockingly. "Your protection? You're nothing but a rejected mail-order husband with no money, no family, and no legal standing in this community. What protection could you possibly offer?" But before Heinrich could answer, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Henderson stood up from her seat, followed by Mr. Peterson, then the schoolteacher Miss Clark, then the blacksmith Tom Brady. One by one, people throughout the church began rising to their feet until nearly everyone was standing. "He's under our protection too," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Both of them are. We've seen how hard Heinrich works, how kindly he treats Margaret, how much better her life has become since he arrived. If you think you can come into our town and threaten our neighbors with your lies and your hired guns, you're mistaken." William looked around the church at all the standing figures, and for the first time since Heinrich had met him, the man appeared uncertain. "You people don't understand what you're interfering with. I have legal documents, official papers. You have lies," Pastor Williams interrupted, holding up William's own letter. "This letter proves you misrepresented your relationship to Johann. It shows you had asked for money before and been refused. And your behavior here today proves that this was never about debt. It was about revenge. Sheriff Daniel Rourke, who had been standing quietly at the back of the church, finally stepped forward. Heinrich hadn't even noticed the lawman's arrival, but now his presence seemed to fill the entire room. "William Hoffman," Sheriff Rourke said in a calm but authoritative voice, "I'm going to need to examine those debt papers of yours, and I mean examine them properly, with someone who knows what legal documents should actually look like." William's face went from red to white in an instant. "You have no right. I have every right when someone's trying to commit fraud in my county," the sheriff replied. "Jake Morrison, Murphy Collins, I suggest you boys step away from your boss and keep your hands where I can see them." Heinrich was amazed at how quickly the situation had changed. 10 minutes ago, William had seemed to hold all the power with his documents and his confident lies. Now he was surrounded by an entire community that had chosen to stand against him. But William wasn't finished yet. As Sheriff Rourke approached to examine the documents, William suddenly grabbed the papers and backed toward a side door of the church. "You think you've won?" he shouted desperately. "This isn't over. If I can't have what's mine legally, I'll take it another way." He bolted for the door with Jake and Murphy close behind him. Sheriff Rourke started after them, but they had too much of a head start. "They're heading for the horses," someone shouted from near a window. Heinrich felt cold fear wash over him as he realized what William meant by another way. The man was desperate now, cornered and dangerous. And desperate men sometimes did terrible things to get revenge. "He's going to the farm," Heinrich said urgently to Sheriff Rourke. "He's going to try to hurt Margaret's property. Maybe burn it down or destroy the crops." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Can you ride, Heinrich?" Heinrich had never been on a horse in his life, but looking at Margaret's frightened face, he knew he had to try. "I'll learn fast." As the church emptied and men ran for their horses, Heinrich took Margaret's hands in his. "Stay here with Pastor Williams where it's safe. I'm going to stop William from destroying your home." Margaret shook her head frantically and wrote on her slate, "Too dangerous. Let the sheriff handle it." Heinrich kissed her forehead gently. "That farm isn't just your home anymore. It's our home. And I'll be damned if I let that man take it away from us." For the first time in his life, Heinrich Zimmerman was riding toward a fight instead of running away from one. And win or lose, he was going to prove that love was stronger than revenge. The sound of galloping horses echoed across the prairie like thunder as Heinrich, Sheriff Rourke, and 6 other men raced toward Margaret's farm under the blazing afternoon sun. Heinrich bounced awkwardly in his saddle, hanging on for dear life as his borrowed horse pounded over the rough ground. But determination kept him upright despite his fear of falling. "There!" Sheriff Rourke shouted, pointing toward a column of black smoke rising from the direction of Margaret's property. "They've already started fires." Heinrich's heart sank as he saw the smoke. All of Margaret's hard work, all the improvements he had made, all their hopes for a future together, everything might already be destroyed by William's desperate revenge. As they crested the last hill before the farm, Heinrich could see orange flames licking at the barn roof while William and his men threw burning brands into the hay storage area. The chickens were running around in panicked circles, and Bessie the cow was bellowing with fear from her pasture. "Split up," Sheriff Rourke commanded. "Tom and Jim, circle around behind the barn. Pete and Sam, head for the house and make sure they don't torch that too. Heinrich and I will take William head on." Heinrich slid off his horse so clumsily that he nearly fell, but he managed to stay on his feet and ran toward the burning barn. The heat hit his face like a furnace, and smoke stung his eyes until tears streamed down his cheeks. William saw him coming and laughed wildly. "Too late, fat man. Your little love nest is going up in flames. The only thing going up in flames is your plan," Heinrich shouted back, grabbing a water bucket that sat near the well. Murphy appeared from behind the barn with a pitchfork, swinging it at Heinrich like a weapon. Heinrich dodged backward, lost his balance, and fell hard on his back. Murphy raised the pitchfork again, but before he could strike, Tom Brady tackled him from the side and sent both men tumbling into the dirt. Heinrich rolled over and pushed himself back to his feet, his clothes covered in dust and his body aching from the fall. But the sight of flames spreading along the barn wall filled him with desperate energy. This wasn't just a building burning. This was Margaret's livelihood, their future, everything they had worked to build together. Sheriff Rourke was grappling with Jake near the chicken coop, both men wrestling for control of Jake's gun. Heinrich wanted to help, but the fire was spreading too fast. If he didn't act immediately, the entire barn would be lost. Heinrich ran to the well and began pumping water as fast as his arms could work. The bucket filled quickly, and he carried it toward the flames, splashing water on the burning hay. The fire hissed and steamed but didn't go out completely. "Give it up, Heinrich," William called from across the yard. "Even if you save the barn, I'll just come back tomorrow night, or next week, or next month. You can't watch this place forever." Heinrich turned to face William, water dripping from his clothes and smoke streaking his face with black soot. "You're right about one thing. I can't watch this place forever. But I don't have to." "What's that supposed to mean?" William demanded. Heinrich smiled through his exhaustion. "It means this isn't just my fight anymore. Look around you, William. Look who came to help." William glanced around the farmyard and for the first time seemed to notice that half the men from town were there, working together to put out the fires and capture his hired hands. Mrs. Henderson had arrived with her sons, carrying more water buckets. Pastor Williams was leading Bessie to safety while his wife rounded up the scattered chickens. "You see," Heinrich continued, walking closer to William, "you made one big mistake in your planning. You thought this was about you versus me, or you versus Margaret. But it's not. It's about you versus an entire community that's decided they don't like bullies." William's face contorted with rage. "I don't care how many people you've fooled. This should have been my farm, my wife, my life. Should have been." Heinrich shook his head sadly. "William, you never understood what love really means. You think it's about taking what you want, forcing people to choose you, making them pay when they don't. But real love is about giving. It's about making someone else's life better, not destroying it when you can't have your way." William pulled out a gun from inside his coat, and Heinrich felt his blood turn cold. But before William could aim it properly, Sheriff Rourke appeared behind him and knocked the weapon from his hand with one swift blow. "William Hoffman," the sheriff said as he snapped handcuffs on William's wrists. "You're under arrest for attempted arson, fraud, and threatening behavior. Your little revenge scheme is over." As Sheriff Rourke led William away, the man shouted over his shoulder, "This isn't finished, Heinrich. You think you've won, but you don't belong here. You're still just a fat fool who got lucky." Heinrich watched William being loaded into a wagon for the ride back to town jail, and he felt something surprising, not anger or triumph, but pity. William had spent years nursing his hatred and jealousy until it poisoned everything good in his life. Heinrich could have ended up the same way, bitter and resentful about all the rejections he had faced. But Margaret had shown him a different path. As the last of the flames were extinguished and the crowd began to disperse, Heinrich heard a familiar sound, the creak of wagon wheels on the dirt road. He turned to see Margaret driving toward the farm, her face anxious with worry. She jumped down from the wagon before it fully stopped and ran toward Heinrich, her slate forgotten in her urgency. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his neck and buried her face against his chest. "I'm all right," Heinrich said softly, stroking her hair. "The barn's damaged but not destroyed. We can fix it." Margaret pulled back and looked into his eyes, and Heinrich saw something there that made his heart race. Her lips moved silently at first, as if she was trying to remember how to form words. Then, in a voice soft as a whisper but clear as a bell, she spoke. "I love you," she said, each word precious and deliberate. "Heinrich, I love you." Heinrich felt tears streaming down his face as he heard her voice for the first time. Not the broken whisper of someone who had lost hope, but the strong, clear voice of a woman who had found it again. "I love you too, Margaret," he replied. "More than I ever thought possible." As the sun began to set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Heinrich and Margaret stood together in the yard of their farm, damaged but not defeated, scarred but not broken. Around them, friends and neighbors finished cleaning up the mess left by William's revenge, their presence a reminder that some battles are won not by individual strength, but by the power of people choosing to stand together for what's right. Heinrich had come to Kansas as a rejected mail-order husband with nothing but a carpetbag and wounded pride. Now he was part of a community, protector of a woman he loved, and builder of a future that neither he nor Margaret would have to face alone. The silent heart had found its voice, and that voice was singing with joy.